They were meant to die on that mountain. That was the law of the high, thin air and the unforgiving stone. A mother lost to a poacher's snare or a rival predator was a death sentence for the young she left behind, a small, final whisper in the grand, indifferent narrative of the wilderness. But on that particular morning, as the sun broke over the jagged peaks of the Drakensberg, a different law found them first. It was the law of a human heart, a force far more unpredictable and, in its own way, just as wild. Ilara Keitler was not a sentimental woman. Or so she told herself. As a field biologist tracking the elusive Cape leopard, her life was governed by data, by observation, by the hard-earned discipline of non-interference. She was a ghost in the landscape, a silent witness armed with GPS collars and camera traps, her job to understand the wild, not to alter its course. For 10 years, she had lived by that creed, her solitude a necessary armor against the constant, casual brutality of nature. Her small stone cottage, perched on the edge of the reserve, was a fortress of scientific rigor, its walls lined with books on ethology and maps marked with territorial boundaries. She found them by accident. A deviation from her usual transect line, following a set of week-old leopard tracks that led her to a collapsed overhang of red sandstone. It was the smell that stopped her first, the sweet, cloying scent of death. She expected to find the remains of a kill. Instead, she found the mother. A large, strangely built canid, her coarse, brindled fur matted with dried blood around a cruelly efficient wire snare. But it was the silence that followed the discovery that was most unsettling. A profound, unnatural stillness where there should have been the rustle and cry of new life. Drawn by a professional curiosity she couldn't suppress, she knelt and peered into the darkness of the den behind the dead mother. A faint whimper. A desperate, thread-like sound. Then another. Her flashlight cut a sharp beam into the gloom, revealing a squirming pile of 3 tiny bodies, their eyes barely open, their fur a dark, fuzzy brown. They looked like puppies. Odd puppies, to be sure, with disproportionately large heads and thick, muscular necks, but puppies nonetheless. Abandoned jackals, she presumed. Or perhaps the feral offspring of a farm dog. The protocol was clear. She was to record the location, note the circumstances, and walk away. Nature would reclaim them. Scavengers would complete the cycle. It was clean. It was correct. Ilara stood up, her joints aching from the cold. She turned her back on the den. She took 3 steps. The whimpering grew louder, more insistent, a sound that bypassed the scientist and struck a chord deep in the woman. It was the sound of an ending. And in the vast, echoing loneliness of her own life, she found she could not bear to witness another one. She broke every rule she had ever lived by. Wrapping the 3 shivering creatures in her field jacket, she carried them back to her cottage. They were impossibly small against her chest, their tiny claws scrabbling for purchase, their faint, milky scent a stark contrast to the death they had just escaped. She told herself it was temporary. A stay of execution. She would get them stable, find a local animal shelter, and return to her life of detached observation. It was a neat, tidy lie she constructed to justify the seismic shift that had just occurred in her world. That first night was a frantic blur of improvisation. She fashioned a makeshift nest from an old wool blanket in a cardboard box, placing it near the gentle warmth of her wood-burning stove. She had no formula, no proper bottles. She managed with a sterilized eyedropper and a warmed mixture of goat's milk and egg yolk, a recipe dredged up from a distant memory of her grandfather's farm. They were ravenous, their suckling weak but determined. As she held the first one, a little male with a spot of white on his chest, she felt a strange and unfamiliar warmth spread through her. It wasn't just the heat from his small body. It was something else. A connection. A purpose that had nothing to do with data points or research papers. She looked at his broad, short snout and the dark, intelligent eyes that were just beginning to focus. Stone, she whispered, the name coming to her as solid and certain as the mountains outside her window. The second, a slightly smaller female, was more anxious. She trembled in Ilara's hands, her whimpers sharp and high. Ilara stroked her back, murmuring soft nonsense until the trembling subsided. Whisper, she named her. The third, another male, was the boldest. He latched onto the dropper with a surprising strength, his gaze direct and challenging even in his infancy. He seemed to carry the echo of the wild mountains in his tiny frame. Echo, she decided. Stone, whisper, an echo. Her temporary project. Her secret deviation from the path. That night, as the three of them slept, their bellies full, their soft snores filling the silence of her cottage, Ilara sat and watched them, the firelight casting long shadows on the walls. The lie she had told herself about finding a shelter had already begun to feel thin and transparent. The truth was, she was keeping them. And she had no idea what she had just begun. The first month was a crucible of survival. Ilara's life, once ordered by the rising and setting of the sun and the patient tracking of leopards, was now dictated by the 2-hour feeding schedule of 3 demanding mouths. Sleep became a fragmented, precious commodity. Her research was neglected, her long hikes into the mountains replaced by anxious vigils beside the cardboard box. She became a mother, a role she had never anticipated or desired, and found it to be the most exhausting, all-consuming work of her life. The puppies were unlike any she had ever known. They grew with an astonishing speed, their bodies transforming daily. Their dark, fuzzy baby fur began to give way to a coarser, spotted coat. Their legs remained strangely proportioned, the front powerfully built and longer than the hind, giving them a sloping, unfamiliar posture. She attributed it to a strange mix of breeds, a mountain mutt of some unknown lineage. Their vocalizations were the strangest part. They didn't bark or yelp in the way of domestic dogs. Instead, they communicated in a complex array of chirps, grunts, and low, vibrating whoops that seemed to rumble up from deep within their chests. When they were excited, especially around feeding time, they would break into a chorus of frantic, giggling sounds that was both endearing and vaguely unsettling. Ilara recorded the sounds in her field journal, labeling them anomalous canine vocalizations, another piece of data for a puzzle she wasn't yet ready to solve. She bought proper puppy formula and bottles from the small town an hour's drive away, enduring the curious questions from the supply store owner. "Got yourself some new helpers, Ilara?" he'd asked. "What breed?" "A local mix," she'd replied, the evasion feeling slick and uncomfortable on her tongue. "Rescues." The bond between them deepened with every feeding, every cleaning, every moment spent watching them sleep in a tangled, breathing pile. They were a clan of 4, a strange and unlikely family huddled together against the vast indifference of the world. Ilara, who had long cultivated an armor of solitude, found it melting away. She spoke to them constantly, her voice, long used only for professional reports or brief exchanges in town, softening into a maternal murmur. She would tell Stone he was her steady rock, praise Whisper for her bravery when she ventured out of the box, and laugh at Echo's clumsy, boisterous attempts to initiate play. They were her secret. A beautiful, complicated secret that filled the empty spaces in her home and her heart. The silence she had once cherished as peaceful now felt empty when they were asleep. The loneliness she had accepted as a condition of her work was gone, replaced by a fierce, tender protectiveness that astonished her. As they moved into their second month, their individual personalities blossomed. Echo was the undisputed leader. Fearless and endlessly curious, he was the first to climb out of the box, the first to investigate every corner of the cottage, the first to initiate their increasingly rough-and-tumble games. His play was a whirlwind of shoulder barging and jaw wrestling, a display of physical power that seemed far beyond his age. Stone was the quiet observer, the thinker. He would watch Echo's chaotic explorations from a distance, his dark eye seeming to calculate and assess. He was more deliberate, more cautious, but when he committed to an action, it was with an unshakable resolve. He was also the most physically affectionate with Ilara, often climbing into her lap and pressing his heavy head against her chest, emitting a low, contented rumble that vibrated through her bones. Whisper remained the most anxious, but her anxiety was coupled with a keen intelligence. She was the problem solver. While Echo would try to brute force his way through an obstacle, Whisper would study it, testing it with a tentative paw, sniffing out its weaknesses. She was deeply bonded to her brothers, but it was Ilara she sought for ultimate comfort, her constant shadow as she moved about the cottage. Their physical development continued to perplex her. Their jaws were astonishingly powerful. One afternoon, she gave them a set of sturdy beef marrow bones, the kind that would occupy a German shepherd for days. Within an hour, Echo had cracked one clean in half with a single, decisive crunch, the sound like a pistol shot in the quiet room. He then proceeded to consume the entire thing, bone and all, with a relish that was both impressive and alarming. Ilara examined the remaining pieces. The bone wasn't just gnawed, it was shattered, crushed. No dog she had ever known possessed that kind of bite force. She made another note in her journal, her scientific mind cataloguing the anomaly even as her heart dismissed it. Exceptional jaw strength. Possible adaptation to scavenging. The world outside her cottage faded into a distant murmur. Her leopard project was on indefinite hold. She ignored the emails from the university, offering vague excuses about equipment malfunctions and impassable trails. Her entire universe had shrunk to the four walls of her home and the three growing lives within it. They had a routine. Mornings were for rambunctious play in the fenced-in yard she had hastily constructed. Afternoons were for long naps, the three of them piled on an old sheepskin rug by the fire. Evenings were for quiet bonding, Ilara reading on the sofa while they chewed on toys or wrestled softly at her feet. She loved them with a totality that frightened her. It was a fierce, primal love, a force of nature in its own right. She was their mother, their provider, their clan. In return, they gave her their absolute, unquestioning loyalty. When she returned from a rare trip to town, they would greet her with an explosive chorus of whoops and giggles, mobbing her at the door, their powerful bodies nearly knocking her over in their enthusiasm. They saw her, it seemed, as the strong, benevolent matriarch of their small, strange family. But as the third month began, the puzzle pieces she had been so carefully ignoring started to assemble themselves into a picture she could no longer deny. They were nearly 50 pounds each now, and still growing. Their sloping backs, thick necks, and massive heads were no longer puppyish quirks, they were defining features of a species she was refusing to name. Their scent, a musky, earthy odor, clung to the blankets and the furniture, a constant reminder of their wildness. The turning point came on a cool, clear evening. She was sitting on her porch, watching them play in the yard as dusk settled over the mountains. They were chasing each other, their movements fluid and powerful. Then Echo stopped, lifted his head to the twilight sky, and let out a sound she had never heard him make before. It wasn't a whoop or a giggle. It was a long, drawn-out cry that rose in pitch, a haunting, almost hysterical call that echoed off the distant rock faces. A sound that seemed to pull at the very fabric of the wilderness. Whisper and Stone immediately joined in, their voices harmonizing in a wild, unearthly chorus. The sound chilled Ilara to her core. It was ancient and alien. It was the sound of the African night, a sound she had heard on documentaries and field recordings, a sound that belonged to the savannah, not the high mountain Finbows. In that moment, the carefully constructed walls of her denial crumbled. The sloping back. The crushing jaws. The giggling calls. The whooping chorus. They were not dogs. She knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, what they were. But to admit it was to invite a catastrophe. To name them was to lose them. Still, she had to know for sure. She had to hear it from someone else, someone whose professional judgment she trusted, someone who could confirm the impossible truth her heart was now screaming at her. There was only one person to call. Dr. Ben Carter, the veterinarian in the town below. A man who had seen everything the mountains had to offer, a friend who had patched up her research subjects and her own occasional injuries for years. She picked up the phone, her hand trembling. "Ben," she said, her voice tight. "I need to see you." I have 3 puppies I need you to look at." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with Ben's unspoken curiosity about her sudden foray into pet ownership. "Of course, Ilara," he finally said, his voice warm and steady. "Bring them in tomorrow morning. I'll clear the schedule. Tomorrow morning." It felt like a death sentence. She hung up the phone and looked out at her 3 beautiful, impossible children, who had finished their wild song and were now tumbling over each other in a heap of spotted fur. A profound wave of grief washed over her. She was about to betray their trust, to expose their secret to a world that would never understand. The world that would take them away. The journey down the mountain was a descent into a quiet hell. Ilara drove her sturdy Land Rover with a grim precision, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. In the back, secured in 3 large travel crates she'd had to buy specially, her family was restless. Echo let out a series of low, anxious whoops, while Whisper whimpered softly, a continuous thread of distress. Only Stone was silent, but Ilara could feel the weight of his stoic presence, his silent questioning of this strange, rattling confinement. She had tried to make it normal. She had spoken to them in the same calm, reassuring tone she always used, scratching their broad heads through the wire mesh before closing the doors. "It's just a little trip, boys," she'd murmured to Echo and Stone. "Just a quick visit, my sweet girl," she'd promised Whisper. The lies tasted like ash in her mouth. They knew. On some deep, instinctual level, they sensed the seismic shift in her own emotional state, the fear that radiated from her like heat. The town felt alien, hostile. The neat houses, the paved roads, the other people walking their perfectly normal dogs on leashes, it was a world they did not belong to, a world she had shielded them from. Pulling into the veterinary clinic's parking lot, her heart hammered against her ribs. This was it. The point of no return. Ben Carter met her at the door, his kind, weathered face etched with concern. He was a tall, lanky man in his late 50s, with a gentle demeanor that belied a sharp, inquisitive mind. "Ilara," he said, his eyes scanning her face. "You look like you haven't slept in a week." "It's been a lot," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "Well, let's see these little monsters who are causing you so much trouble," he smiled, trying to put her at ease. The word monsters landed like a physical blow. She flinched. They brought the crates into the main examination room, a large, sterile space that smelled of antiseptic and animal fear. The sounds from the crates were growing louder, a mixture of agitated chirps and frustrated grunts. Ben, ever the professional, approached the first crate, Echoes, with a calm confidence. "All right, big fella. Let's have a look at you." Ilara's hand shook as she unlatched the door. Echo exploded out of the crate, not with aggression, but with a boisterous, contained energy. He immediately began to investigate the room, his powerful nose to the ground, his sloping gait more pronounced than ever on the flat, tiled floor. Ben froze. The easy, professional smile vanished from his face, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated astonishment. He didn't move. He simply stared at Echo, his eyes wide. He looked from the animal to Ilara, then back again, a silent question hanging in the air. "Let the others out, Ilara," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its earlier warmth. It was the voice of a scientist, a diagnostician faced with an unbelievable specimen. She opened the other 2 crates. Stone emerged slowly, deliberately, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on Ben, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. Whisper shot out and immediately pressed herself against Ilara's legs, trembling. The 3 of them stood in the center of the room, a tableau of wild, impossible beauty. The chorus of their combined scents, musky, earthy, alive, filled the sterile space. For a long minute, the only sound was the frantic ticking of the clock on the wall and Whisper's soft whimpering. Ben walked a slow, deliberate circle around them. He didn't try to touch them. He just observed, his eyes missing nothing, the powerful forequarters, the non-retractable claws, the distinctively sloped back, the massive skulls. He knelt down, not to get closer, but to examine the floor where Echo had left a small puddle of drool. He looked at their teeth, the huge, bone-crushing premolars visible even when their mouths were closed. He finally stood up and turned to face Ilara. He took off his glasses and polished them slowly, a gesture she knew he used when gathering his thoughts to deliver difficult news. "Ilara," he began, his voice heavy with a weight she had been dreading for weeks. "We've been friends a long time. So I'm going to ask you to be completely honest with me. Where did you get them?" "On the mountain," she said, her own voice hollow. "Their mother was dead. A snare. I thought they were puppies." Ben let out a long, slow breath, a sound of profound sympathy and dawning horror. He looked at the three animals, who were now huddled around Elara, sensing her distress and closing ranks to protect their matriarch. "Elara," he said, and the gentleness was back in his voice, but it was a gentleness reserved for tragedy. "These are not dogs." She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the word. "They're not jackals. They're not any kind of wild dog I've ever seen in these mountains." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Their species hasn't been documented in this region for over a century. We thought they were gone from here." He walked over to a bookshelf and pulled down a heavy zoological textbook. He flipped through the pages, his fingers tracing down a list of names before landing on one. He turned the book around and showed her the picture. There they were. A full-grown adult, its powerful form captured in a photograph from the Serengeti. The same sloping back. The same massive head. The same intelligent, intense eyes. And beneath the picture, the two words that confirmed her nightmare. Crocuta crocuta. The spotted hyena. The room tilted. Every strange detail, every anomaly she had explained away, rushed back with the force of a tidal wave. The giggling. The whoops. The bone-crushing jaws. Their complex social hierarchy. Their matriarchal clan structure. It all made perfect, terrifying sense. She hadn't been raising puppies. She had been raising the most successful, most intelligent, and most misunderstood predators in Africa. "Oh, God," she breathed, sinking onto a nearby stool. "Ben, what have I done?" He put a steadying hand on her shoulder. "You saved their lives, Elara. You did something extraordinary. You raised 3 hyena cubs from infancy. Do you have any idea how impossible that is?" But his words of comfort were lost in the roaring in her ears. She looked at Echo, Stone, and Whisper, and for the first time, she saw them not as her children, but as what the world would see them as, dangerous wild animals. Apex predators who, in a few more months, would be strong enough to kill a grown man. The law was not just a suggestion here, it was absolute. It was illegal to keep indigenous predators. The Department of Wildlife Services would be notified. They would be confiscated. And because they were habituated to a human, they could never be released. They would be euthanized. The clinic, which had felt like a place of revelation, now felt like a cage closing in on all of them. The scientific name, Crocuta crocuta, echoed in her mind. It was a label, a classification, a death sentence. But as she looked into Stone's dark, trusting eyes, as Whisper pressed her trembling body closer, as Echo stood guard before her, she knew that name was a lie. They were not specimens. They were not statistics. They were Stone, Whisper, and Echo. They were her family. And she would not let the world kill them. The drive back up the mountain was a silent procession of grief. The diagnosis hung in the air of the Land Rover, thick and suffocating. Elara looked at her family in the rearview mirror, their shapes huddled in the crates, and saw them with a painful new clarity. She saw the nascent power in Echo's shoulders, the deep intelligence in Stone's watchful eyes, the nervous, flickering energy in Whisper. She saw not just her beloved companions, but the magnificent, wild creatures they were destined to become. A destiny she had irrevocably altered. Ben's words replayed in her mind. "You have 2 choices, Elara. Neither of them is good." The first was to call Wildlife Services, the official, correct, and fatal path. The second was unthinkable. To try and keep them, to hide 3 of Africa's most formidable predators in her backyard, a lie that would inevitably end in tragedy for them or for someone else. But Ben had underestimated her. He saw 2 choices. She was determined to forge a third. Back at the cottage, the familiar comfort of her home felt tainted. The sheepskin rug where they slept, the sturdy chew toys now revealed as laughably inadequate, the very air thick with their unique scent, it was all evidence of her profound, love-fueled delusion. She led them out of the crates and they swarmed her, sensing the deep well of her sorrow, nudging her with their heavy heads, licking the tears from her face with their rough, pink tongues. Their comfort was a sharp, beautiful pain. They had no idea she was the source of their impending doom. For 2 days, Ilara descended into a feverish state of research. Her neglected scientific mind roared back to life, but this time her subject wasn't leopards. It was hyenas. She devoured academic papers, conservation reports, and sanctuary websites. She learned about their intricate social lives, their matriarchal clans where females were dominant, their astonishingly complex vocalizations that conveyed specific, detailed information. She read about their intelligence, which rivaled that of primates, and their crucial role as ecosystem regulators. The more she learned, the more her awe grew, matched only by her despair. Everything she read confirmed how impossible her situation was. Hand-reared hyenas were a notorious problem. They lost their fear of humans but retained their wild instincts, a lethal combination. They could not be integrated into wild clans, which would view them as outsiders and kill them. They were caught between two worlds, belonging to neither. She made calls, dozens of them, to wildlife sanctuaries and conservation projects across southern Africa. Her reputation as a serious biologist opened doors, but the conversations were uniformly grim. Most facilities were not equipped for large predators. Those that were had no space. Many gave her the same lecture she had been giving herself: she had made a terrible mistake. She should have left them to die. With each rejection, the walls closed in further. The official, terrible choice loomed larger. She would sit on her porch at night, watching them under the moon, their spotted coats like constellations in the darkness. She would listen to their soft whoops and murmurs, a private language she had come to understand, and the thought of that language being silenced forever was a physical agony. It was on the third night, when hope had dwindled to a single, sputtering ember, that she found it. A small, privately funded carnivore rehabilitation center in Namibia. It wasn't a zoo or a public sanctuary. It was a research facility dedicated to the unreleasable. Their mission statement hit her like a lightning bolt: to provide a life of dignity and purpose for predators caught in the conflict between the human and wild worlds. Their website spoke of specialized techniques for integrating hand-reared animals into semi-wild enclosures, creating new, artificial clans. They focused on psychological well-being as much as physical health. It was a long shot, a fragile sliver of hope, but it was the only one she had. She wrote an email, pouring out the entire story. She attached her detailed notes from the past 3 months, the growth charts, the recordings of their vocalizations, the observations of their social dynamics. She wrote with the desperate precision of a scientist and the raw plea of a mother. She confessed her mistake, her naivety, her profound, unbreakable bond with them. She hit send and felt like she had just launched her heart into the void. The reply came less than 24 hours later. It was from the facility's director, a Dr. Anya Venter. The email was cautious, professional, but it contained a single, life-altering sentence: "Your detailed behavioral data is extraordinary, Dr. Keitler. It suggests a level of social bonding that might make integration possible. We are willing to try." The relief was so immense, so absolute, that Ilara's legs gave out and she sank to the floor, sobbing. They had a chance. It was a chance that would cost her everything. The sanctuary required a substantial donation to cover the lifelong care of 3 large predators, a sum that would consume all of her savings. It would mean transporting them over 1,000 miles. And most painfully, it would mean giving them up forever. It was a brutal, heartbreaking price. And she would pay it without a second's hesitation. The final week was a period of suspended reality, a strange, sun-drenched pause between the verdict and the sentence. Knowing they were leaving, Ilara cherished every moment with a fierce, desperate intensity. She no longer saw them as puppies she was protecting, but as the young hyenas they were, magnificent beings on the cusp of their power. She took them for long walks in the fenced yard, watching the fluid, loping way they moved across the earth. She sat with them for hours, listening to their complex conversations, marveling at the subtle shifts in tone and pitch. She played their favorite game, a rough-and-tumble wrestling match where they would mouth her arms with an exquisitely controlled gentleness, their massive jaws capable of crushing bone, holding her with the delicacy of a promise. She would look into their eyes and see not a reflection of herself, but a glimpse of an ancient, wild intelligence she was privileged to know. She recorded everything. Hours of video, hundreds of photographs. She filled notebooks with observations, documenting their every interaction, every preference, every fear. This was her final gift to them, a detailed portrait of who they were, a manual for their new caregivers, a testament to the family they had been. The day the transport vehicle arrived was a day of crystalline, terrible beauty. The sky was a flawless blue, the air crisp and clean. The large, climate-controlled truck with the sanctuary's logo on the side felt like an alien spaceship descending upon her small, secluded world. Dr. Venter had come herself, a woman with kind eyes and a firm, no-nonsense demeanor. She assessed the three of them with an expert's gaze, her quiet approval a small comfort to Ilara. The process of crating them was a controlled, professional affair, a stark contrast to the frantic, emotional journey to Ben's clinic. Ben himself had come to assist, his presence a silent, supportive anchor. Echo, ever bold, walked into his crate with minimal coaxing, his curiosity overriding his apprehension. Whisper, true to her nature, had to be gently guided, Ilara murmuring to her the whole way, her hand resting on the trembling flank. The hardest was Stone. He seemed to understand what was happening. He refused to move, planting his feet and looking at Ilara with an expression of such profound, quiet betrayal that it shattered her heart. She knelt in front of him, pressing her forehead to his. "It's okay, my steady boy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This is for you. This is so you can be who you were meant to be." She stayed with him until he finally, reluctantly, followed her into the crate. The sound of the latches clicking shut was the sound of finality. The sound of the truck's engine starting up was the sound of her world being torn apart. She stood on the porch, watching the truck navigate the winding dirt road, growing smaller and smaller until it was just a dust cloud against the vast, indifferent mountains. And then, silence. A profound, crushing silence that the wind could not fill. The cottage was no longer a home, it was just a building. The sheepskin rug was empty. The water bowls were dry. The air was thin and empty of their scent, their sound, their life. The secret was over. Her family was gone. Months passed. The seasons turned on the mountain. Ilara returned to her work, tracking her leopards with a renewed focus that felt more like a penance than a passion. The ache in her chest was a constant companion, a hollow space that would never be filled. She had done the right thing. She knew that with every fiber of her being. But the right thing felt like a wound that would never heal. Then, one evening, an email arrived. It was from Anya Venter. The subject line was simple, "Your clan." Attached was a video file. With a trembling hand, Ilara clicked it open. The screen filled with the sight of a vast, natural enclosure in Namibia, a landscape of red earth and acacia trees under a wide, open sky. And there they were. They were magnificent. Larger, stronger, their spotted coats gleaming in the sun. They were interacting with two other young hyenas, part of the new clan Anya was carefully constructing. She watched as Whisper, no longer timid, cleverly instigated a chase over a piece of hide. She saw Echo, his confidence radiating, engage in a ritualized greeting with a larger female. And then she saw Stone. He was sitting slightly apart, observing the others, his calm, steady presence a clear anchor for the group. He looked peaceful. He looked powerful. He looked home. As the video ended, Ilara didn't realize she was crying until a tear hit the keyboard. It was not a tear of grief, not entirely. It was a complex alchemy of loss and love, of heartbreak and a quiet, fierce triumph. They were not hers anymore. They had never truly been. They belonged to the wild, and she had, against all odds, managed to give a piece of it back to them. The bond forged in her tiny cottage had not been a mistake. It was a bridge. A strange, impossible bridge that had carried 3 orphaned lives from certain death to a future she could never have given them. She had lost her family, but she had saved her clan. And as she looked out at the mountains, she knew their whoops and giggles were woven into the fabric of her soul, an echo that would sound within her for the rest of her days.